guys, this is Amy from Amy Kristin Photography, and I am here to talk to you today about something that people ask me about a ton, which is depth of field. Before I start, I just want to let you know that my cat Lionel may be showing up in the video. He thinks he's quite the star, so if you see him, that's cool. He's really cute and fuzzy. Anyhow, depth of field is something that people, I think, tend to struggle with a lot, and people ask me about it a lot. So I wanted to kind of break it down for you. People often ask me how I know what depth of field is going to be for a certain situation. And they say, is there a formula that you know? How do you know it? All that stuff. Well, technically there is a formula. And if I'm good enough with iMovie, I will float the formula somehow in this frame. I can't promise that. There's a lot of variables in the formula. There's a lot of letters, numbers, having to do with f-stop, hyperfocal distance. It's a big formula. I can guarantee you that I am never out shooting in the field doing multivariable math in my head. That does not happen. My father may be a math teacher, but that doesn't happen. What I really have learned is over the years of shooting, on film SLRs a long time ago and then digital, hi Lionel, is that I basically just learned from experience what my depth of field is going to be. Another thing that can be helpful just to start out with so people know is that there's depth of field calculators that you can download for your smartphone. This is my smartphone. And I have a text. Anyways, so to begin, depth of field has 3 critical factors. The first one is focal length. The longer your focal length, the narrower your depth of field will be. So if you take a shot, say you have a 17 to 55 lens, and you take a shot at 17 millimeters, and say your aperture is 2.8, and then you stand in the same place, and you take the same shot with if you zoom into 55 millimeters, your depth of field is actually going to be less at 55 millimeters than it is at 17 millimeters. So the longer the focal length, the shorter the depth of field, given all your other variables are the same. You know, if I was going to take a portrait shot with this is my 5D Mark III, and this is my grapefruit lens, I call it. This is my 85 1.2. My depth of field, taking the same shot at the same distance, would actually be a lot less than if I took the same shot with, hold on, wrong lens. Got a lot going on in this camera bag. Technical difficulties, follow along. This is my 50 millimeter 1.2 lens. They're both 1.2 lenses, but because this one has a greater focal length than this one, I would actually have less of a depth of field taking a shot with all the other variables the same at the longer focal length. So we're going to just put this back in the camera bag for now. Okay. The second factor that comes into play when you talk about depth of field is a big one. It's your aperture. The wider your aperture, which is actually a smaller number, the less your depth of field is going to be. Conversely, the smaller your aperture, smaller hole, bigger number, the greater your depth of field is going to be. So if we again took a portrait, say I was shooting somebody and I was shooting them and I decided I was going to shoot at 1.2 with this lens. That's a very wide aperture. It's very difficult to take portraits at 1.2, especially with the 85. It's possible, but you know, it takes a lot of skill, and the depth of field is really pretty razor thin, depending on how far or how close you are to them. However, if I stop my lens down, even to say if I stop down to 2.2, my depth of field will get greater. If I stop down to f8, it would be even greater. So obviously, because your aperture has something to do with your depth of field, if you're taking a portrait of a family and you know, you're not going to want to use something really a really wide aperture unless they are all lined up really super close next to each other and are all on the same plane, so to speak. So if I'm at 1.2, my wide aperture, my depth of field is really, really narrow. But the smaller I make my aperture, the wider my depth of field, my focal plane is getting. You know, it goes front to back, and then it goes side to side and up and down to infinity. So aperture getting smaller, number getting bigger, focal plane getting wider. So if you have a lot of people who are staggered, who you're wanting to fit into a shot, you need to stop down your lens some. And again, knowing what to stop down comes from experience. It comes from knowing your focal length, knowing some other factors, and there are also, for people who are out in the field and want to be on the go and check things, there are those apps that you can put on your phone. The third factor that comes into play with depth of field is your distance from your subject. So if I took a shot of you, probably I would want to take my lens cap off, but if I was taking a photo of somebody and I was at 85 millimeters with this lens at f2 and I was only 3 feet away, my depth of field would be relatively narrow. You know, they would have their eyes in focus, probably their eyes in their nose, but then, you know, the focus would start falling off behind their ears. However, if I backed up to 12 feet and took the same photo, that whole person would be in focus. You know, the depth of field would be greater. I've taken photos, landscape photos actually at, say, like f2.8, where I focused on something that was quite far away. I might have focused on something that was on the horizon or way, way far away. And almost everything in the shot is in focus, even though my aperture is really wide, because my distance from my subject, which was my tree, my horizon, whatever, was so far away, everything ends up being in focus. Or the depth of field is extremely wide. It encompasses almost everything in the shot. A couple other things to take into consideration. One of them is if you have a crop sensor camera, your depth of field is actually going to be greater than it would be on a full frame camera. Lionel is attacking things again, just so everybody knows. The reason for that is not necessarily, it's not because depth of field, it's not because, I'm going to have to edit this part. It's not because full frame cameras have something that makes them these magical beings of super shallow depth of field and stuff like that. It actually is because with a crop sensor camera, your sensor requires you to essentially be farther away from somebody to get the same shot that you would be closer with on a full frame camera. That's because the crop sensors essentially crop the view. Your focal length, if you have a Canon, is actually 1.6 times what your marked focal length is on your lens. If you have a Canon, and Nikon is 1.5. So just take the focal length that's on your body and multiply it by 1.5 or 1.6 to get your effective focal length. So as I talked about before, distance from subject is one of the factors that affects depth of field. So if I have, if I'm shooting with my 5D Mark III, which is a full frame camera, and I'm at 85 millimeters, if I want to take a shot of somebody, you know, a 3/4 shot, I may be something like 8 feet away, depending on my setting, something like that. If I wanted to take the same shot of somebody on my crop body, my 7D Mark II, frame it the same way, because my crop sensor camera has, you know, it's giving me a 1.6 crop factor, I'm actually going to have to back up farther. I'm going to have to back up 1.6 times, essentially, what I was before, which is something like 13.5 feet, 13.6 feet, something like that. So I'm going to be farther away. And because I told you guys before that your distance from your subject affects your depth of field, the farther you are away, the greater your depth of field, you're actually going to have a wider depth of field at a given aperture on a crop body camera. I've heard people say things like, oh, you know, crop cameras actually make you lose an aperture or something like that, like a 1.8 lens isn't really 1.8 on a crop body. It is 1.8. You know, aperture is actually, it's another relative thing. It's a formula. It's all math. We're not going to get too crazy and do a lot of math right now because I don't want to. It's Friday. I don't want to do math. but it's a ratio. Aperture is a ratio. A 2.0 is not always the same size. It depends on your lens's focal length. So a lens that is 1.8 is always 1.8. Whether it is sitting on a 7D, whether it's sitting on a 5D Mark III, whether it's sitting on my head, it is always a 1.8 lens. The reason I guess that people say that is because you are effectively losing bokeh, or however you pronounce it, bokeh, bouquet, bokeh, I have no freaking clue. You're, losing bokeh and you're gaining depth of field with a crop body because you have to be farther away from your subject. Anything else that I want to point out? Oh, yes. One other kind of math-like, but not really thing. If you're taking the same shot at the same aperture with two different lenses, but you're framing the shots the same, your depth of field is going to be the same. So let me kind of explain what I'm talking about, because you guys are like, what is she talking about? Okay. Say that I wanted to take a picture of you. And when I say you, I'm kind of doing this in a Mr. Rogers kind of way, like I'm talking to you through the TV. Say I want to take a picture of you, and I'm taking a headshot of you. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find my 50mm lens in here. Oh, got it on the first try. This is my 50mm 1.2 lens. So I'm going to pretend I'm going to put that on my camera. I don't know, I'm going to set it at, say, 1.2 just for funsies. I'm going to stand like 8 feet away from you and take a photo. And my depth of field is going to be something like 6 inches or something like that. 1.2 on a full frame body, 8 feet away, 6 inches. So then I'm going to put my 85mm lens on my camera, right here, which is still on here. And I'm going to take a photo of you. Now before I told you that focal length affects depth of field, and it does. But if I want to take the same photo of you that I took with the 50, or at least frame it the same, I'm going to have to step backwards, because with the 50, I have a wider angle of view. With my 85, I'm actually closer. So where I was 8 feet away before, when I was taking a photo of you with my 50, I'm going to have to probably back up to about 13.5 feet, something like that, to get the same frame shot. If we, do some math and figure out what the ratio is between 85 and 50 and, the distances, trust me, this works. So if I back up to about a little over 13.5 feet with my 85 and also shoot at 1.2, my depth of field is still about 6.5 inches. And you might be asking me why that is, because before I told you that focal length has to do with depth of field. And you're probably like, lady, are you lying to me? No, I'm not. If I stood in the same place where I was and took the photo of you that I took before with my 50 and also had it at 1.2, the depth of field would be much less with the 85. It would probably be something like 2 inches, around 2 inches. However, I backed up. So focal length does affect depth of field, but it's all relative. If you're in the same place and you shoot a photo with 2 different focal lengths, 5 different focal lengths, a million different focal lengths if you're like me and you're a lens hoarder, you're going to have different depth of fields depending on your focal length. However, it is a relative thing when you get closer or farther away based on how you need to frame it. So there's that. I'm pretty sure that I've explained everything that I wanted to explain to you guys today. Lionel's just walking across the frame. Not sure if you guys can see him. Hopefully, I made some sense. And if anybody has any questions for me, or if I really confused the heck out of anybody, please feel free to tell me, and I will try to clarify things for you. I'm definitely not a movie maker by any means, so hopefully this film actually came out okay. And thank you for watching, and hopefully there will be another episode soon.